Thank you. So welcome again to BankTrack's webinar to share the results of our Latin America human rights benchmark. I'm Ryan Brightwell. I lead BankTrack's human rights campaign work, and I'm joined by Inés Racionero, the report's author, and by Julia Nieva from Connect Us. I'm going to start by introducing the report and talking a little bit about BankTrack's human rights campaign before handing over to Inés to present the results. So to briefly introduce BankTrack, we're a tracking, campaigning and civil society support organisation working on private sector commercial banks and the impacts of their finance on people and planet. We were founded in 2003 as a network of organisations collaborating on advocacy towards the commercial banking sector. And in 2015, we became an independent NGO. So last year, we just celebrated our 20th anniversary. We're based in the Netherlands, but with a focus on commercial banks around the world. And our mission since the start of 2022 is to challenge commercial banks to act urgently and decisively on 4 interrelated global emergencies: the accelerating climate crisis, the ongoing destruction of nature, the risk of ever more pandemics, and the widespread violation of human rights. And today we're here to talk about our new benchmark of Latin American banks, which is of course part of our human rights campaign work. To put things in some context, since the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights were endorsed in 2011, the focus of our human rights campaign has been advocating for their full implementation by the banking sector, not because we think that the UN Guiding Principles are perfect, but because they're the best international framework that we have, and we consider that their full implementation would lead to better outcomes for rights holders than we have now. Benchmarking banks is a core stream of our work, but it's not the only aspect of our work on human rights. We also work on what we term dodgy deals. We also engage with banks and banking sector initiatives like the Equator Principles, and we produce briefings on specific policy areas. And to talk a bit more about the history of our benchmarking work on human rights, our first benchmarking report came out in 2014 under the title of Banking with Principles. And this followed 3 years between its release and the UN Guiding Principles being endorsed, where there had been a number of discussions in the banking sector about what the UN Guiding Principles mean for banks. For example, at the TUN Group, which formed itself shortly after the endorsement of the Guiding Principles as a group of commercial banks set up to discuss the meaning of the principles and their relevance to the banking sector. And although these discussions were useful, they also left several questions unanswered, for example, around remedy. And we felt in 2014 that, important as those discussions are, it was time to ensure there's a focus on the work of implementing the principles as well. And that's been a key reason for us continuing to produce the benchmark, to keep a focus on implementation of the guiding principles. And we updated the benchmark in 2016, 2019, and 2022, extending the remit from at first 32 to most recently 50 banks. And in 2021, we produced our first regional benchmark, covering 14 banks headquartered in Africa. In 2022, we followed this up with a second regional benchmark focused on Asia. And we've been pleased to be able to add to this with our first regional benchmark for Latin America. In total, we've benchmarked at least 95 banks with the project in total, which has helped focus scrutiny on these banks' human rights policies, processes and reporting, and encouraged a degree of progress from the sector. The second main theme of our human rights work is our dodgy deal work. What we term dodgy deals are harmful projects or companies financed by banks. Our profiles of dodgy deals function as campaign platforms. Their selection is driven really by the needs of campaigning organizations that we partner with and affected communities. Our work on dodgy deals is typically aimed at stopping banks from financing a project or company which is incompatible with respect for human rights, climate, and nature. Or it may be where communities are not opposing the project outright, but our advocacy is aimed at ensuring the project proceeds in a way that respects human rights and the environment. We've highlighted a handful here of the 30 or so dodgy deal profiles we have published on the BankTrack site in the Latin America and Caribbean region. Many of these are marked as red for on record, meaning they haven't been updated in the last year. The exceptions are JBS, the world's largest meatpacking organization, which is a current target dodgy deal, and CPMC, the Chilean pulp and paper company, which has been the focus of recent work, and other profiles, including Peru, we're working on updating currently. And 8 of the banks that we've benchmarked are linked to at least one dodgy deal on the BankTrack website. And the third stream of our human rights work to mention is a series of briefing papers that we've produced on specific policy areas of relevance to human rights. These include how banks contribute to human rights violations, a paper which sets out 8 cases in which we consider a strong argument could be made that banks had contributed to adverse human rights impact through their finance, rather than only being directly linked in the language of the UN guiding principles. A paper called Developing Effective Grievance Mechanisms in the Banking Sector, produced with Oxfam Australia, which sets out how and why banks should be meeting their responsibility to provide effective grievance mechanisms for those affected by their finance. And the paper We're Unable to Comment on Specific Customers, which sets out how banks can in fact overcome the hurdle of client confidentiality and makes the case for a much more transparent banking sector. And you can find all of these publications on our website. Also worth highlighting is that we've sought advice on 2 occasions from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the UN on specific questions around implementation of the UN guiding principles in an effort to resolve matters where there's been a lack of clarity or a disagreement. And this has led to very valuable guidance covering questions around when banks might contribute to human rights violations as opposed to being only directly linked to them, and their responsibilities when it comes to remedy of adverse impacts and the establishment of grievance mechanisms. And also, in the case of the second advice paper, the responsibilities of banks and other investors when it comes to their role as nominee shareholders or custodians of shares. So this has been very useful and influential advice in clarifying the sector's responsibilities. And a final point before I pass on to Inez to present the results of the benchmark. So 2021 was the 10th anniversary of the UN Guiding Principles. The UN published 2 reports, the first taking stock of what had been achieved in the previous 10 years and what had not been achieved, and the second setting out a roadmap for the way forwards. The stock-taking report referenced our most recent benchmark at the time in pointing to what it characterized as slow progress from the finance sector as a whole, although other parts of the sector, like private equity and venture capital, were identified as lagging even further behind banks. And following the stock taking, the roadmap for the next 10 years led with a call, as you see on the front cover, to raise the ambition and increase the pace of business respect for human rights. And the report included specific recommendations for finance, including adopting policies, due diligence and grievance processes, and publicly disclosing, importantly, how salient human rights risks and impacts are being addressed. And in December last year, a few months ago, the United Nations Working Group on Business and Human Rights launched the Spanish language report, How to Integrate Human Rights in Finance in Latin America and the Caribbean. with recommendations again for action by states, institutional investors, and commercial banks. So at a UN level, the slow pace of change has been raised as a concern, and the UN has set banks a priority list, essentially. So on that note, it's over to Inez to talk about the extent to which banks are acting on this priority list, as the benchmark shows.
Thank you, Ryan. Well, before moving to the benchmark results, I will start with an introduction of our methodology. Regarding the scope of the report, we focus on the largest commercial banks by assets in Latin America, including banks that are smaller than those evaluated in the 2022 Global Benchmark Report, and subsidiaries of banks headquartered outside the region, but that, however, have a strong regional presence. This resulted in a list of 17 banks, and we evaluated the policies, processes, and reporting of these banks against a set of 14 criteria based on the requirements of the UN Guiding Principles. These criteria are divided into 4 categories: policy commitment to human rights due diligence process, reporting on human rights, and the provision of remedy. Each individual criterion was assigned a score of 0, 0.5, or 1, resulting in a total of 14 available points. This allows us to categorize banks as laggards, followers, moderate achievers, or leaders based on their total number of scores. To start the process, we informed the banks in our scope about the project and shared our benchmarking criteria with them. That was in September. By the end of October, we had already assessed these banks against the 14 criteria of the UN Guiding Principles and assigned them draft scores. In November, we shared these draft scores with the banks and gave them the opportunity to provide feedback within a 2-week period. Of the 17 banks that we contacted, 9 actually provided input, and the remaining 8 did not respond. In December, we finalized the scores based on the feedback received. The scores of 2 banks actually increased after this feedback. And from January through March, we wrote the report and finally published it. The bank's results are now public and available in a set of 17 individual web pages, which are linked to the benchmark report. In this, not only banks' final and draft scores appear, but also our criteria for our rationale for scoring, banks' feedback, and our own responses to that feedback. Now moving on to the key findings of the report. Our analysis shows that Latin American banks are meeting fewer than half of their responsibilities under the UN Guiding Principles. This is evident when we see that the highest scoring bank has achieved only a 7 out of 14, being the only one ranked as a moderate achiever. This means that the rest of the banks have achieved less than half of the available points, with 9 ranked as followers, 7 as laggards, and none as a leader. The average score of these 17 banks was of 3.4 out of 14, which compares with a score of 5 out of 14 in the 2022 global benchmark. However, it's worth noting that when compared to their Asian and African counterparts, Latin American banks are showing better results, as in the Asian and African regional benchmarks, the average scores of these banks were lower, and also the majority were ranked as laggards. Continuing with the key findings, we saw that all but 1 banks in our scope have a statement or policy addressing human rights to some degree. However, in practice, this doesn't translate into the implementation of human rights due diligence processes, despite over half of the banks claiming to conduct the human rights due diligence processes. The vast majority of them received either no score or a 0.5 score in any of our 5 due diligence criteria. Regarding reporting, none of the banks reporting covered the bank's main human rights impacts, and instead they only covered internal human rights policy developments. Lastly, regarding remedy, none of the banks achieved a full score for having established or participated in an effective grievance mechanism for those adversely impacted by their findings. And overall, we see that there's a clear gap between banks' expressed human rights commitments and the implementation and the actual implementation of processes to identify, prevent, and mitigate impacts on human rights. Now we will start with our first category, which is policy requirement. Here we assess whether banks have a human rights policy in place at all, whether this has been approved at the highest level of the entity, and whether this extends across all the bank's provision of finance. To start off, we see that criteria 1.1 is actually the one where banks achieve the highest score in the benchmark. In fact, the vast majority of banks have adopted a human rights commitment, actually, which is positive, sorry. But however, in only one case, this was approved at the highest level of the entity, no? With a board member tasked with governance oversight of human rights. Regarding the scope of the policy, while also here the majority of banks indicate that their human rights commitment extends to at least some areas of their provision of finance, only 2 banks state that this extends to all the bank's provision of finance, including asset management and bond underwriting. This is very important, given that the main source of a bank's human rights impacts is precisely their provision of finance. Now entering to category 2, which is the human rights due diligence process. Here we start assessing whether banks have a human rights due diligence process in place. And we actually found that the majority of banks do have some form of human rights due diligence process. Although in most cases, as you can see, this was limited in scope or not described in detail, and that's why the majority of them received only a half score. Only 4 banks achieved a full score for conducting a human rights due diligence process that was aimed at identifying and addressing human rights impacts that was carried out on an ongoing basis and that extended across all the bank's operations. Then our second criterion of the human rights due diligence process is consultation. And consultation is actually a key aspect, no, in identifying human rights impacts. So it is central to the human rights due diligence process. However, as in the global benchmark, we see that consultation remains a major gap, as no banks achieved the full score here. Only 6 banks received a half score, as for instance, it wasn't explicitly stated that potentially affected groups were consulted among stakeholders consulted, or if it was not clear if the consultation process was part of a process for identifying impacts. It was alarming to see here that despite Latin America being the most dangerous region in the world for human rights defenders, none of the banks mentioned consulting human rights defenders as part of their process of identifying impacts. Then regarding the allocation of responsibility, which is criterion 2.3, the majority of banks provided some information on the main team responsible for human rights issues more broadly, but only 2 provided details on the teams responsible for assessing human rights impacts specifically, no? And in this case, that's why only 2 of them achieved full scores in this criteria. For the 2 remaining due diligence criteria, we see prominent large red bars indicating a clear lack of compliance, no? Assessing their relationship to an impact is key for banks to evaluate their capacity to influence, prevent, and mitigate adverse consequences, but also it is key for banks to evaluate the extent to which they need to play a role in the remediation of impacts, no? This is particularly important here, given that our research shows that 8 of the banks in our benchmark are associated with at least 1 active dodgy deal profile, as Ryan just mentioned, and 10 are listed in the Forest and Finance database, which indicates exposure to companies and projects with human rights challenges attached. Despite this, it is very concerning to see that only 1 bank has a process in place for assessing whether it has caused or contributed to an adverse impact, although in this case, it didn't describe the process in detail, and that's why it only achieved a half score. And finally, for our last due diligence criterion, tracking the effectiveness of its response to an impact, 2 banks did have some process for tracking the effectiveness of their response to an impact, but as this was not fully aligned with the guiding principles, these two also only achieved half scores. Moving on to our third category, reporting, we see that reporting within Latin American banks is clearly underdeveloped. No? To account for how they address any identified human rights impacts, banks need to first communicate externally what their main human rights impacts are, and second, communicate the steps that they are taking to address them. No? In this case, as you can see, the majority of banks reported on some internal policy developments. In this case, yes, like human rights policy developments and training initiatives, and that's why the majority of them achieved half scores. But however, none of them achieved the full score, as none of them reported on their main human rights impacts. No, this again, given that, as we just mentioned, 8 banks are linked with at least one active dodgy deal profile, and 10 are listed in the Forest and Finance database, it's concerning, no? And evidence is that banks need to do more in terms of reporting, especially if they are to contribute effectively to remedy. Regarding the next criterion, 3.2, 2 banks provided some information on their response to particular human rights impacts, but this, however, was limited, and therefore no full scores were achieved. 5 banks did report at least one indicator related to their main human rights, to their human rights performance, sorry. But as none of the indicators related to the bank's main human rights impacts, no full scores were achieved here. This might seem like a minor requirement, but in fact, this is central to the UN guiding principles. It is precisely through indicators that banks can measure and verify the extent to which the human rights processes that they have in place are effective in achieving the outcome of preventing and mitigating human rights impacts, which means that without indicators, banks risk having human rights processes that are ineffective to that end, no? And that's why they are so important. Finally, the last category, access to remedy, as you can see, is the one with the lowest score in all the benchmark. When a business identifies that it has caused or contributed to an adverse human rights impact, its responsibility to respect human rights requires active engagement in remediation. To meet this requirement, banks should first make a clear commitment to provide remedy, and secondly, have a process in place for doing so, no? Including the establishment of an effective grievance mechanism. Well, as you can see, for criterion 4.1, sorry, although 5 banks did make a clear commitment to providing remedy, none of the banks have a process in place for doing so. That's why no full scores were achieved here. As for the grievance mechanism, 8 banks have some form of grievance mechanism in place, but however, this was not explicitly able to address human rights issues, accessible to affected rights holders, and supported by a clear process for handling complaints. Therefore, again, no full scores were achieved here. And finally, our last criterion, the effectiveness criteria. Here we see that no banks received a score at all, as none of them explained how they considered that their grievance mechanism meets the effectiveness criteria of guiding principle 31. And well, in conclusion, it is positive, and we welcome that the majority of banks in the benchmark are committed to respect human rights. This is a positive first step. However, we also see that banks do not have systems in place that allow them to support this claim with confidence. As the UN guiding principles tell us, banks need to know and show that they respect human rights. And to do so, they need to implement concrete actions and processes oriented to the result of preventing, mitigating, and addressing negative impacts on human rights. A result which should be measurable and verifiable by indicators. These concrete actions and processes should also include making use of the bank's power of leverage to influence positive human rights practices among their clients and investee companies. And therefore, fulfilling the commitment to respect human rights requires a proactive approach to identifying, preventing, and mitigating impacts to human rights, both prior the provision of finance and throughout the entire financing life cycle. Thank you.
Thank you, Inez, for the presentation, and thank you to everyone for your attention. We have a Q&A section coming up, but before we get to that, we're very pleased to welcome Julia Meio Neiva from Connect Us in Brazil as a guest speaker. Julia is one of the founders of Connect Us, and we'd like to ask you to reflect a little on the findings of the benchmark in the contexts of the kind of human rights issues and trends that you at Connect Us see and are working on in the region.
Thank you so much, Ryan. So good morning, good afternoon for those who are in the afternoon parts. It's a pleasure to be here today, although we've been speaking about difficult things. First of all, I'd like to say congratulations. This is a very important benchmark and research. And I really hope that everybody that is here today listening to us learn a bit and contributes to the change we need to see urgently to make this our region and the world safer, more equal and fair. So when we discuss the impacts of the financial institutions projects in our region, so this is what I'm talking about, we see that it is a region already exposed to human rights violations and in a context of poverty, hunger. So we understand that financial institutions and the private sector in general needs to understand what they are investing and acting. So this has to be more responsible. So we totally urge institutions to commit to effective and serious human rights due diligence. So the BankTrack results do reveal there is a large gap in corporate responsibility that we still have in our region and society. So we believe there are tools there for not only Latin American but other societies to continue pressuring financial institutions and the private sectors for real commitments that will prevent human rights impacts and violations from occurring, including the impact of climate change. So I don't have much time, right? But something that I've been always saying is that our region has been impacted by the colonization, structural racism, structural inequalities. So we need to have impact now. We don't have any more time to wait for institutions to be irresponsible. Something that we noticed is that many institutions analyzed in the benchmark have not done so well, right, Ines? So this is for both European banks and Latin American banks. So we can see that both or all of them need to do better and contribute less to these adverse impacts. Regarding Brazilian banks, for instance, we noticed, unfortunately, they have not been performing that well regarding participation, for instance, which is something that we understand is totally linked to actually preventing human rights violations from happening. So guaranteeing that communities, civil society, and other groups have access to information and to spaces of participation and decision-making to also contribute to prevent violations from happening. Another aspect that I think we saw as important that was pointed out also was that there seems to be a lot of talking about ESG, but this has not been enough to actually change the impacts. So there is a lot of greenwashing and on the projects that these financial institutions invest on. So this is something we need to look carefully in this research to bring the effective change that we need to see. So my, what I actually wanted to say is just the final words, right? Is that we believe financial institutions and company should look into this data and make sure they learn how to invest in our countries, but in other countries, right? It depends on the company, is not only adopting policies, because most of them have already policies, but they have to implement seriously. So it's just not a piece of paper. So they have to make sure that they include climate issues, including human rights in a broad perspective, so including climate issues, with more transparency, with spaces for permanent participation and responsibility. And one thing that we have pointed out in our case against a bank was that banks need to have transition plans also, effective transition plans. So that's it. I think financial institutions need to be more responsible, contribute to be part of the solution of a fair world, and have impact to combat poverty, hunger, the impacts of climate change and human rights violations. I think these are, my minutes are already have gone, but I'll be here for if you have any further questions. And again, congratulations for this important research.
Thanks so much, Julia, and yeah, it'd be very welcome if you can stick around for the Q&A, which we're going to start now. I'm going to stop the recording. As I said, the Q&A is going to be held under Chatham House rules. So let me just do that now.